This is the first episode of what I'm calling, for the moment, AutSide After Dark. The name is borrowed in part from a political media project that I've admired for some time. One of my favourite political channels, Second Thought, eventually found itself running into the limitations of YouTube. Excuse me. Certain conversations could happen there, others could not. Some topics were too complex, some were too controversial, some simply did not fit comfortably inside an advertising-driven algorithm. Their solution was simple. The public version stayed on YouTube, and the deeper conversation moved elsewhere. The conversation after the conversation. The version where people could slow down, wander a bit, follow a thread further than the algorithm preferred. Maybe ask questions that were difficult to compress into 10 minutes on a thumbnail. And I find myself thinking about that recently, because I'm a political commentator, because I have had a similar experience. Many of you will have noticed that I'm no longer posting my podcasts on YouTube. This was not an accident. Over the past year, I've found myself increasingly frustrated by the ecology of the platform. Not the merely unpleasant occasional comments. Any public platform attracts those. What troubled me more was the cumulative effect of trying to have a complex conversation inside an environment that optimized for speed, for certainty, for reaction and simplification. The kinds of things I want to talk about increasingly seem to require the opposite. Slower thinking, longer arcs, ideas that are still forming, questions that don't yet have answers, experiences that cannot be reduced to 5 bullet points. The deeper I moved into writing about gestalt processing, language, delayed knowing, identity, memory, and meaning making, the more I felt a tension between the shape of the ideas and the shape of the platforms carrying them. And that brings me to this morning's chat, in the absence of Kathy. One that I titled, The Colour Was There All Along, in my notes. You might describe that talk as being about autism, and I understand why. Autism is the obvious subject. Gestalt processing is the obvious subject. Language is the obvious subject. But the more I sit with that talk, the more I think it was actually about something else. It was about enclosure. It was about what happens when knowledge exists but remains inaccessible. It was about what happens when an entire landscape is present, yet the pathways leading into it are blocked. The colour was there. The language was there. The explanations were there. The people were there. What was missing was access. A route through. And the more I look around, the more I realise that this pattern appears everywhere. It happened with gestalt processing. It happened with language. It happened with autism. And increasingly, I think it may be happening online as well. Today, I want to explore 2 examples. The first concerns what happens when speech becomes mistaken for language. And the second concerns what happens when analytic cognition becomes mistaken for autism itself. Both are enclosure stories. Both are visibility stories. Both involve the things that have always been present but remain surprisingly difficult to see. So let's begin with language. And with a question. Why do so many speech and language conversations seem obsessed with speech? Now, I understand why this happens. Speech is visible. Speech is measurable. Speech is easy to count. Did the child speak? How many words? How many utterances? How many conversational turns? How many requests? How many comments? Those are all reasonable questions. The problem is that speech and language are not the same thing. Speech is a delivery mechanism. Language is something larger. Language is how we organize reality. Language is how we construct identity. It's how we connect events separated by years or decades and recognize them as part of the same story. Language is how we understand relationships, how we understand ourselves, how we understand what happened to us. And yet, so much of the system behaves as though speech is the destination. The child talks, the services end, case closed, success achieved. But what if speech was never the destination? What if speech was the beginning? What if learning to talk is not the same thing as learning to understand? What if producing language is not the same thing as constructing meaning? And what if the most important language development occurs long after people stop paying attention? These questions have become increasingly important to me because they describe my own life. I received my autism diagnosis in my 30s. I did not discover gestalt processing until my 50s. Think about that for a moment. More than 20 years passed between those two events. 20 years. An entire adult lifetime, an entire professional career, multiple graduate degrees, a doctorate, marriage, children, teaching, research, writing. An entire life lived without access to a framework that explains some of the most persistent patterns in my experience. When I discovered the work of Anne Peters, Barry Prezant, and Marge Blanc, something extraordinary happened. I did not suddenly acquire new experiences. The experiences I had always been there. What changed was the language. I finally possessed concepts capable of organizing experiences that had previously existed only as fragments. Suddenly I could look backward. Suddenly patterns emerged. Suddenly decades of confusion began rearranging themselves into something coherent. That was not speech development. I already spoke. That was language development. That was the development of meaning, the development of understanding, the development of narrative, the development of self-knowledge. And that raises a question I find increasingly difficult to ignore. What if language development continues throughout the lifespan? Not vocabulary, no grammar, no articulation, meaning, identity, narrative coherence, relational understanding, the ability to place one's experiences into words, the ability to recognize recurring patterns across decades, the ability to construct an account of oneself that actually makes sense, the ability to answer a deceptively simple question. What happened to me? I sometimes wonder how many autistic adults are doing precisely this work without anybody recognizing it as language development. Because when most people hear the phrase language development, they imagine a small child, a preschool classroom, speech therapy, picture cards, early interventions. They do not imagine a 55-year-old woman sitting at a computer trying to understand why certain experiences from 30 years ago still feel unfinished. And yet, that might be language development too. In some ways, it might be the most important language development at all, because language is not merely communication. Language is orientation. Language is the difference between living inside an experience and understanding it. And this is what I want to talk briefly about sensual residue. Some people assume the project is primarily about sexuality, and certainly sexuality appears within it. Desire appears within it. Relationships appear within it. Bodies appear within it. But I increasingly think those things are not the central subject. The deeper subject is language. The project exists because I now possess language that I did not possess when many of those experiences occurred. I am revisiting events that happened years ago, sometimes decades ago, not because the events changed, but because the language changed, because the interpretive framework changed, because I finally possess concepts capable of holding experiences that previously floated through my life without attaching themselves to anything. So what happens when adult language arrives after experience? What happens when understanding is delayed by 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? What happens when a person spends half a lifetime collecting experiences and only later acquires the vocabulary required to understand them? The project is not fundamentally about sex. The project is about delayed meaning, delayed narration, delayed recognition. It's about discovering that entire portions of your life remained partially untranslated. And once you see that, it becomes difficult not to see it everywhere. Which brings me to a small provocation. And I want to be clear here. I'm not proposing a new natural language acquisition stage. I've done that once. I'm not attempting to revise Marge's framework again, but I sometimes find myself wondering whether there is a metaphorical stage 7 that nobody talks about. Not a childhood stage, an adult one. The lifelong construction of self through language. The integration of memory, the development of narrative identity, the gradual organization of experience into meaning, the ability to look backward and recognize yourself, the ability to tell the story of your own life and hear perhaps for the first time a coherent voice speaking through it. The ability to speak oneself into existence. Because when I look around autistic communities, I see people doing this work everywhere. I see adults trying to understand childhoods they could never previously explain. I see adults attempting to build narratives large enough to contain diagnosis, masking, relationships, trauma, transition, exclusion, belonging, work, family, identity. I see adults building meaning. I see adults developing language. And yet almost nobody calls it language development. The field remains focused on speech. It remains focused on childhood. Yet almost nobody calls it language development, right? It remains focused on observable behaviors. Meanwhile, some of the most profound language work any autistic people will ever do is happening quietly, privately, decades after the service has ended. Which makes me wonder whether we've confused the doorway for the house. The speech matters. Of course it matters. And communication matters, of course. But if language is ultimately about meaning making, then learning to talk may not be the end of the journey. It may be the moment the journey finally begins. So, if the first enclosure happened inside professional systems, I think the second enclosure may be happening online. And again, I want to be careful. I'm not suggesting conspiracy. I'm not suggesting malice. I'm not suggesting anybody intentionally excluding anyone else. Enclosures rarely work that way. Most enclosures emerge because certain forms are rewarded whilst others become increasingly difficult to sustain. The result may look intentional from the outside, but often it's just simply structural. A road gets built, traffic flows down the road, everything else gradually becomes harder to reach. I think something similar may be happening with contemporary autism discourse. And I noticed it long before I had the language for it. For years, I found myself reading autism content online and feeling strangely disconnected from it. Not hostile, not opposed, just disconnected. The experiences being described were real. The observations were useful. The creators were often thoughtful and sincere, and yet something consistently felt unfamiliar. Something didn't quite map. I can explain why. And then eventually I began noticing a pattern. Many of the most visible autistic influencers seem to communicate in ways that feel profoundly analytic. And again, it's no criticism. Analytic processing is real, right? Analytic processing is valuable. Analytic processing describes many autistic people. But once I saw the pattern, I kind of stopped seeing it. The communication style often centers around traits, characteristics, lists, categories, symptoms, boundaries, rules, explanations, 5 signs you might be autistic, 7 things autistic people wish you knew, the 10 common masking behaviors, 3 communication tips, 6 relationship mistakes. Right? The format itself should feel familiar because social media rewards exactly this structure. Discrete units, clear segmentation, portable information, small, wee chunks. The algorithm loves wee chunks. It loves things that can be immediately recognized, immediately categorized, immediately shared, immediately consumed. And in many ways, this makes perfect sense. Platforms are designed to hold complexity. They are designed to distribute attention. Those are not the same things. The problem is not all forms of cognition compress equally well. This takes me back to the main Sunday morning's piece. The colour was there all along. One of the questions I asked near the end of the talk was, how do you compress 5 decades of lived experience into a meme? I still didn't know the answer. And more honestly, I increasingly suspect there may not be one. Because many forms of gestalt communication operate differently. They require accumulation. They require resonance. They require context. They require relation. They require duration. The pattern often arrives before explanation. Recognition arrives before vocabulary. The whole of it often arrives before the parts, which creates a problem. Social media tends to reward the opposite sequence. The explanation must arrive immediately. The context disappears. Accumulation disappears. The relational field disappears. The whole never arrives. Imagine trying to explain why a piece of music moves you by examining a single note. Imagine trying to explain a forest through one leaf, trying to explain a 30-year friendship through a text message. Something essential gets lost. Not because the note is wrong or the leaf is wrong or the text message is wrong, because the thing itself, it exists on a different scale. And increasingly, I wonder whether many adult gestalt processors spend enormous amounts of time trying to communicate experiences that exist at scales our current platforms struggle to support. And this is where the idea of the script garden enters. Many have heard me use that phrase before. I think of a script garden as the ongoing cultivation of language across a lifetime. No memorized scripts, living scripts, growing scripts, relational scripts, meaning-making scripts. The frameworks we slowly assemble to connect experiences separated by years or decades. Structures that allow understanding to attach. The language that makes recognition possible. And when I look around the adult gestalt communities, I see people engaged in this work constantly, trying to connect childhood experiences to adult experience, to connect diagnosis to memory, to connect language to identity, trying to connect relationships, work, family, transition, education, trauma, belonging, and meaning into something coherent, trying to build gardens. And then they go looking for resources. And often what they find feels strangely foreign. Not wrong, foreign. The language is familiar, the topic is familiar, diagnosis is familiar, the cognitive ecology feels different. The assumptions feel different, the pathways feel different, the experience feels translated from another architecture. And I increasingly suspect this happens because many adult gestalt processors occupy an unusual position. Autistic people are already a minority, but gestalt processors may represent a visible minority within that minority. I know we don't really have numbers about that. But a cognitive minority nested inside another cognitive minority creates a particular kind of invisibility. The wider culture often struggles to see autistic experience. That part is familiar. But what happens when portions of autistic experience become difficult to see even within autism itself? What happens when the dominant voices within a minority population reflect one processing architecture more often than the other? Another. Nobody is necessarily doing anything wrong. The visibility patterns simply reproduce themselves. The same few pathways become easier to travel. The same few explanations become easier to find. The same few stories become easier to tell. Meanwhile, the other experiences, they remain difficult to articulate because the language itself remains underdeveloped. The irony is that many adult gestalt processors seem to discover gestalt processing in remarkable similar ways. Not through formal education, not through professional guidance, not through diagnostic reports or structured pathways. through resonance, through accident, through stumbling across a book, an article, a podcast, a lecture, a passing comment, a sentence that suddenly lights up an entire landscape. The same thing happened to me. I didn't find gestalt processing because a system successfully delivered it. I found it because I wandered into it. And when I did, the colour came rushing back. That should concern us, because Peters was writing about these things, these distinctions, decades ago. The knowledge exists. The observations exist. The people exist. And yet, even now, many adult gestalt processors continue discovering themselves through coincidence. Not because the field doesn't exist, because the pathways remain incomplete. The enclosure is smaller than it once was, but the gates are still difficult to find. So I want to bring these two threads together because at first glance they may seem unrelated. One concerns speech and language. The other concerns social media and autism discourse. One lives inside professional systems. The other lives inside digital platforms. And yet the more I think about them, the more they appear to be expressions of the same underlying pattern. The speech-language system tends to privilege speech. Social media tends to privilege analytic communication. And neither of these developments occurred because somebody sat in a room and decided to exclude anyone. They emerged because certain things are easier to observe than others. Speech is observable. Meaning is not. Behavior is observable. Processing is not. Output is observable. Architecture is not. A completed sentence as visible, 10 years of cognitive labor required to produce it, are largely invisible. A social media post is visible. Decades of accumulated experience behind it are largely invisible. Institutions naturally drift to whatever they can reliably measure. Platforms naturally drift to whatever they can reliably distribute. The problem begins when measurement becomes mistaken for reality. Because what can be measured is not always the same thing as what matters. And I think many autistic people have lived inside this distinction for most of their lives. People see the outcome, they miss the infrastructure. They see the grade, they miss the tutoring. They see the degree, they miss the translation labor. They see the job, they miss the exhaustion. They miss the language. They see the appearance of independence. They miss the ecology of making that independence possible. And when that happens repeatedly, something subtle begins to occur. The visible thing gradually replaces the underlying thing. The measurement becomes the phenomenon. The map becomes the territory. Speech becomes language. Behavior becomes understanding. Performance becomes capacity, and eventually entire dimensions of experience disappear from view, not because they stopped existing, but because our attention shifted elsewhere. And this is why I keep returning to the word ecology. Ecology asks different questions. An ecological approach does not begin by asking, can this person speak? It asks, how does meaning emerge for this person? An ecological approach does not begin by asking, can this person function independently? It asks, what conditions make functioning possible? An ecological approach does not begin by asking, what does this person produce? It asks, what supports, relationships, translation, structures, environments allow that production to occur? Ecology redirects attention away from outcomes toward conditions, away from appearances and toward architecture, away from measurement and towards relationship. And increasingly, I think that many of the arguments occurring within autism spaces are actually arguments about ecology, even when nobody uses that word. Who receives support? Who appears disabled? Who appears successful? Who counts as autistic? Who gets recognized? Who gets believed? These debates often seem to focus on outcomes, but beneath them all sits a deeper question. What are we actually observing? Because if we only observe visible outcomes, we are inevitably privileging people whose support needs remain hidden. And if we only observe visible communication, we are inevitably privileging forms of communication that align with existing systems. The system sees what it was designed to see. Everything else risks becoming background. And that leads me to what I think the real question beneath this conversation is. Not, are speech and language pathologists wrong? Not, are autistic influencers wrong? Not, is analytic processing wrong? None of those are the question. The real questions are, what forms of cognition disappear when systems optimize for visibility? What forms of language disappear when systems optimize for speech? What forms of knowing disappear when systems optimize for explanation before recognition? Because recognition and explanation are not the same thing. I think many gestalt processors know this in their bones. Recognition arrives first. A feeling, a resonance, a pattern, a sense that something fits. Only later does explanation arrive. Only later do the words appear. Only later do frameworks emerge. Only later does understanding catch up with knowing, but many of our institutions reverse that sequence. Explanation first, recognition second. Show your work, provide evidence, define your terms, demonstrate your reasoning. Support your assertions with 3 snippets of text from the book. All of those things have value, of course. They matter. But what happens when a person genuinely knows something before they can explain it? What happens when the whole arrives before the parts? What happens when understanding exists in a form that has not yet become language? I suspect a great deal of autistic experience lives precisely in that territory. The territory between knowing and saying. Territory between recognition and explanation. The territory between experience and language. And perhaps that is what enclosure ultimately does. It doesn't merely block access to information. It narrows the range of realities that can become visible. It privileges certain forms of knowledge whilst rendering others increasingly difficult to recognize. Not impossible, just difficult. And once we understand that, a different task emerges. The task is not simply to gather more information. The task is to build better pathways. Pathways between speech and meaning, between recognition and explanation, between experience and language, between one processing architecture and another. Because the color was never the problem. The language was never the problem. The people were never the problem. The question has always been whether the pathways exist. So I want to return briefly to the train, to color, to enclosure, to pathways. Because when I first told that story in the Sunday morning's recording, the color was there all along. I framed it as a moment of recognition. The color was there, the landscape was there, the history was there. What changed was access. What changed was the ability to perceive what had always existed. But as I have been reflecting on that talk and the crafting of the scripts for this one, I realized there's another story underneath it. A story about archives, a story about memory. A story about what happens when ideas need somewhere to live whilst they wait for the rest of us to catch up. So back in 2022, one of the first major pieces I published here on AutSide was an article called Beyond Management, Classroom Ecology, Alexithymia, and the Autistic Need for Flow. And it began with ecological approaches to disability. It drew on the ecological enactive model of disability. It argued that disability doesn't simply exist inside people. It emerges in the relationship between people and their environments. It asked educators to stop thinking about control and start thinking about ecology. And at the time, I thought it would become an academic paper. I submitted it to journals. They all declined, some politely, some silently. The paper needed some place to land. So I built one. In many ways, that's why AutSide exists at all. Not as a platform, not as a brand, as an archive. a place where ideas can survive long enough to find their readers, a place where unfinished thoughts can remain available until the language catches up, and a place where a paper that has no home can still exist. And what fascinates me now is that when I return to these old pieces, I rarely find what I thought I wrote. I find new meanings. I find ideas that had not fully emerged yet. I find seeds. I find early versions of arguments that would not become clear for another 3 or 4 years. And I find traces of gestalt processing before I had the language for gestalt processing. I find traces of ecological thinking before I understood how central ecology would become to my work. I find pathways, and perhaps that's another reason I continue to write long form. Not because every piece is perfect, quite the opposite. Because the archive itself becomes a kind of script garden, a place where ideas continue to grow long after publication, a place where old language acquires new meanings, a place where people can return years later and discover something that was invisible the first time, including me, especially me. And what continues to astonish me more than 4 years into this project is that I'm not tending that garden alone. There are now more than 3,000 people gathered around this work. Readers, listeners, commenters, correspondents, people who write to tell me that a piece helped them understand themselves, people who tell me they finally found language for something that they had carried for decades, people building their own script gardens, their own pathways, their own archives of meaning. I still find that remarkable. And I am especially grateful to those who support this work financially through paid subscriptions. Not because this is how business is, but because it's an act of trust, an act of solidarity, an act of saying that these conversations matter enough to keep having, that long-form thinkers and long-form thinking still matter, that archives still matter, that pathways still matter, and perhaps that is where I want to leave things today. The colour was there all along. The language was there all along. The meaning was there all along. The people were there all along. The question was never they existed. The question was whether the pathways existed. Whether there was a route between experience and language, between recognition and explanation, between one mind and another. And perhaps that is a thread connecting the colour was there along, sensual residue, the script garden, the rejected classroom ecology paper, and this new AutSide After Dark project. Not discovery, access. Not invention, visibility. And not the creation of colour, the creation of pathways. Places where ideas can wait. Places where language can grow. And places where people can find themselves. So, with that, thank you for spending your time with me, and have a great day.